The Honourable Prime Minister with ministerial arrangements.
Mr. Speaker, I inform the House that the Minister for Tourism and the Minister for Resources, the Honourable Alan Griffiths, is overseas on government business this week. In his absence, questions on resources should be directed to the Minister for Prime Ministry and Energy, the Honourable Simon Crean, and questions on tourism should be directed to the Minister for Local Government and Minister for Family Support, the Honourable David Simmons.
Questions without notice. Are there any questions? The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question without notice is to the Prime Minister. I ask the Prime Minister, will he be informing President Suharto in his meeting next month that Australian aid is linked to Indonesia's observance of internationally recognised standards of human rights?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Australia's made its position on human rights clear over a very long period of time, and it made its position on human rights clear again after the massacre in Dili, and we expressed our objection, our abhorrence at that occurrence to the government of Indonesia. But the seriousness with which that issue has been taken by the Indonesian authorities, their response, the response of the President, their response in relation to the military officers who were engaged in the execution of those orders, has been, as far as the government's been concerned, a credible response, and I think that's also been shared by the world community. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to Indonesia as the former Prime Minister was going there. I'm going there as a visitor as a Prime Minister of Australia from a country in their near neighbourhood. I will be naturally raising issues of concern to us, including human rights. But I see the visit as an opportunity to build closer ties between Indonesia and Australia in both trade and commerce. Australia has not in the past made its aid policies conditional upon precise arrangements for what the Leader of the Opposition calls human rights arrangements. And the fact is, Mr. Speaker, it's not linked. It's not linked, and hasn't been linked, and won't be during the visit. But I look forward to the visit to meet the Indonesian President, members of the government, to try and improve both commercial, trading and general social and cultural links between Australia and Indonesia.
The Honourable Member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is directed to the Treasurer. Has the Treasurer seen reports of a study which claims to show that the introduction of a consumption tax would boost economic activity by some $7 billion? Can the Treasurer advise the House whether, on the basis of these claimed benefits, the government is reconsidering its position to the introduction of such a tax? What are the government's intentions on this matter?
The Honourable Treasurer.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for Fisher for his question. I did see a press report this morning about a study by Dr. Michael Porter and Andrew Chisholm, which purports to show the benefits referred to by the honourable member for Fisher. But I don't think in this report, although it is reported in terms that a consumption tax would have a major beneficial effect on Australia, actually contains any joy for the proponents of any such proposal. In the first place, hasn't got me worried, Peter. Hasn't got me worried. But I tell you, it ought to have you worried.
Order.
It ought to have you worried.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting.
Because we've had a string of commentary on the possible implications of a consumption tax in Australia, and this is just another in the long line which raises serious reservations about this whole proposal. And of course, this it's another of the GST cheer squad which has come out again raising real and fundamental questions about whether or not this is a practical proposal for Australia, and certainly whether, in the context of the opposition's policy, it could ever effectively be introduced. Because what this study says, as indeed other studies have said before, is that if real wages were maintained in the face of the inflationary impact of a consumption tax, I quote, GDP actually declines. So if real wages are maintained in the face of the inflationary pressure coming from the introduction of a consumption tax, GDP actually declines. So what on earth are we trying to achieve here? What on earth are we trying to achieve? Something which is based on an if, a gigantic if. Because Mr Chisholm goes on to say, if the opposition's policy is well designed, workers won't need a wage rise because they will be compensated for the effect of a GST by tax cuts. But if, and here we go, if the trade unions don't perceive that workers have been properly compensated, then there's going to be a problem. And, Mr Speaker, this is a gigantic problem. It's a problem which leads to a reduction in GDP. Now, the authors of this study are not the first who have come up with this hair-raising warning, which the opposition seems intent on turning aside. They are not interested in these warnings, but because it's not the first time it's come. Because Dr Murphy from the ANU said, if, again this word if wage increases were obtained to compensate for the inflationary effect of the GST, GDP would be 4% lower within 5 years. So here we have a policy, the warnings about which are becoming daily more intense, that if you cannot keep the inflationary consequences out of the wage system, then GDP will actually decline. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, the opposition says, oh, well, that's okay because we've got a wages policy. Well, search as you might for some reference to the wages policy within the opposition's documents. Within the 800 pages, what we find is this.
Order. The honourable member for O'Connor on a point of order.
Just to demonstrate that we don't mind the minister continuing with covering our and making and exposing our policy.
What is the point of order?
I want to draw your attention, as I did on a number of occasions, to section 142. The minister was asked what were the government's intentions. So far, we've just had another diatribe on... I'm sorry, Mr Speaker, I haven't finished my point of order. My point of order is simply this. The government has said they will never have a goods and services
The honourable
tax.
member for O'Connor resume his seat.
Are you saying I cannot continue my point of order?
The member will resume his seat.
Is that what's happened to democracy?
The honourable member will withdraw that remark. The honourable member will withdraw that remark. The honourable member resume his seat. Order. The member for Kooyong will remain silent. The member for Kooyong will resume his seat. On the point of order raised by the member for O'Connor, there is no point of order. The honourable minister.
Point of order.
On a further point of order.
I would simply like an explanation as to why there's no point of order.
I have been asked to rule on the point of order. I've ruled on the point of order. The honourable member for Kooyong. If the honourable member for Kooyong wants to dispute that ruling, he can do so in the forms of the House.
I'd be able to dispute it if you gave me the reason.
If the honourable member for Kooyong intervenes in such way again, I will name him. The honourable minister.
Mr Speaker, search as you may for some reference to the opposition's wages policy, you find a little over half a page out of 800. And yet they have the cheek to say the centrepiece of the coalition's economic policy is industrial relations reform. Here's half a page of it out of 800. And yet what we know is that this whole proposal is built on sand unless you can deal with the inflationary consequences of this introduction. This is a policy, basically a boffin's policy, an impractical policy based on a gigantic if, unless, of course, you believe that the compensation package is in fact a fair one and one which should be accepted by ordinary Australians. But of course what we know is this. What we know is
Order.
this.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting.
70%.
I warn the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. The Honourable Minister. Order.
70% of wage and salary earners in households will be worse off as a result. Those on earning about $25,000 a year would be $7.50 worse off. Those on $38,000 would be $8 a week worse off. So, Mr Speaker, here we have incontrovertible evidence that in fact people are going to be worse off as a result of this introduction, and what is clearly said by this study, again on top of the Murphy study, that unless you can convince workers that they don't have to maintain their real wages to compensate for the introduction, then the impact will go into wages and GDP will fall. What is the point of such a policy if all you want to do is contract the economy to actually reduce the size of the Australian economy by 4%? I think this study suggests that if anyone should be thinking again, it's you, Dr Hewson, and your colleagues over there.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question without notice is again to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, is it your government's view that the issue of self-determination for East Timor is effectively closed, and if so, why?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, it's been the policies of both parties on this question for many years that it's effectively closed. It's effectively closed by the actions of the mid-1970s. And what the Australian governments over the period have sought was a set of arrangements which brought harmony and a political settlement in Timor, which operated effectively between the government of Indonesia and the peoples of East Timor. Now, I don't remember the opposition of the day, the then government of the day, which governed Australia then in the intervening period, the critical years from 1976 onwards, advocating that policy, so you have no credibility in asking a question like this whatsoever.
The Honourable Member for Barton. Order. The House will come to order. There is far too much noise. Members of the Opposition will cease interjecting. Order. The Member for Barton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is also directed to the Prime Minister, and I ask him what action is the government taking to improve employment in Australia, and further, what factors could adversely affect these targets?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I just didn't hear the first part of the question.
Could the Honourable Member repeat the question? Order. There is far too much noise. If members on my left continue to interject, ministers will not be able to hear the questions. The Honourable Member for Barton. Order. The Member for Barton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is directed to the Prime Minister, and I ask what action is the government taking to improve employment in Australia, and secondly, what factors could adversely affect these targets?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the government has, over a long period of time, been very successful at increasing rates of economic growth and employment in Australia. Over the period 1983 to 1990, we have seen a net 1.5 million jobs being created, and now in the government's One Nation statement, we have seen a role for the public sector in promoting growth to bring Australia from recession to recovery and to strengthen that process. As well as that, Mr Speaker, we have seen a change in relation to the structure of Australian industry to make it more supple, to make it more competitive, and to give it a greater chance to trade competitively in the world, to lay a stronger and more viable foundation for employment over the period. But, Mr Speaker, it seems that the government and the opposition have different policies in relation to tariff protection, industry restructuring, but which policies the Leader of the Opposition attempts to portray as being not distinct between the two of us. In fact, the Leader of the Opposition had to say last week on the 26th of March, under a heading, "Keating destroys his credibility on tariff reform," the Prime Minister's attempts to portray his tariff policy as distinct from the Coalition's is pure disinformation. He said, well, how come the Leader of the Opposition said in his reply to the March 91 statement, although I congratulate, this is the then Prime Minister, for his move in this direction, although he will still have 25% protection in the textile, clothing and footwear industries and 15% protection in the auto industry by the year 2000. I mean, how come he made the distinction then, but sought this week to say that there was no distinction, it was disinformation on my part? How come that he had to say in a press statement on the 10th of March 1991, or will it allow us to establish an industrial structure that will not need tariff protection by the year 2000? Or how come the member for Barker said on the 12th of March 1991, the question was, you applaud the moves on tariff reductions, do you? Mr McLaughlin, I do, but you'll note that we've said that these tariff reductions, both in general and in the automotive and TCF, should come down to negligible levels by the year 2000. Now, this government won't quite get there. This government won't quite get there. In other words, won't quite get there, although he still will have 25 protection on TCF and 15 on the auto industry. You're happy to make the distinction then, but not happy to make it when I was in a tyre factory in Victoria. Not happy to make it then. Not happy to make it then. Now, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition's tried to claim that I said one thing and then did another. In the statement on the 12th of March 1991, Building a Competitive Australia, in the statement which I had as part of that document, I had this to say on page 22 of the document. Today's statement completes the program announced in the economic statement of May 1988. Completes the program. That is, that the endpoints 25, 15, 5 and 0 were the completion of the program. I then said, a day after the statement on the Hayden Sargent program in Queensland, so if you take clothing and footwear, that tax is going to be down from 35 to 15%. In other words, and that's going to be the end of the section. That's at the end of the phase down. And I went on to say, because it has to be phased. You see, this package started in 1988. This started in the package of 87-88, and the phasing will complete in 1997 and the year 2000. Now, Mr Speaker, I also made the point in the House of Representatives to the member for Barker on the 17th of September 1990, and I had this to say. The Shadow Minister has an objective of a zero tariff level by the year 2000, as I understand it. The average level of protection increased during the 7 years of the Fraser government. This Labor government has reduced protection levels, but we make decisions about whether we want industries. For instance, we want a car industry. We know that a car industry will not function at zero protection levels, but apparently those opposite believe that at zero level of protection, a car industry will remain viable. It will not. The opposition is really saying it does not want a car industry. I went on and made it very clear in further references in that answer, Mr Speaker, that I didn't believe a zero level by the year 2000 in cars was desirable nor achievable. I made it obviously and patently clear. Now, Mr Speaker, the tariff levels which obtained in clothing in 1983-4, the effective level was 222%, falling to 52% as a result of the March 91 program. In clothing, textile and clothing and footwear, it's 227 to 50%, and that's in the Industry Commission report if you're interested to bother to look. In motor vehicles, Mr Speaker, it's fallen from 250% down to 36%. And in the same period, Mr Speaker, and you see a graph in the same report of the Industry Commission, which shows a falling level of protection under this government, but rising during the period of the Fraser government when Dr Hewson was the principal economic advisor. and I tabled for the interest of honourable members a photocopy of that graph. Now, Mr Speaker, the fact of the matter is that the Leader of the Opposition, as an advisor to the former Treasurer, not only did not decrease tariff protection but actually increased it during the period of their office. We've brought it down to 25% for textiles, 15% for motor cars, 5% for general manufacturing and 0% for DC preferences.
Order.
Announced it, said it was the end of the section, and then the Leader of the Opposition, really by a process of disinformation, tries to say that my attempt to portray the tariff was not distinct from the coalition, even though he blackguarded the former Prime Minister the day after the statement, saying that you still had 25% for clothing and footwear and 15% for protection for the auto industry. Now, Mr Speaker, the fact of the matter is, this man has no credibility on tariffs whatsoever. None. None. None.
Order. The House will come to order.
Speaker, there's the red line.
The House will come to order.
There's the credibility. There's the credibility. This is the man who let tariff protection rise.
Members on my left will cease interjecting. Order. The House will come to order. Order.
This is the man who let tariff protection rise in the 70s, but it's only this government which has reduced it. But we will not go out to wipe out the motor vehicle industry.
Order.
We will not wipe the industry out. We are not going for zero levels by the year 2000, and I've never ever said we were, Mr Speaker. We're not going to zero levels.
Will come to order.
To zero levels by the year 2000 for textile, clothing and footwear. And all we saw from the Leader of the Opposition was him seeking to close the gap between the two parties in relation to the electorate of Wills, where he knows that the 5,000 people working at Southern Pacific Tyres will go out of business at a zero tariff, that the motor vehicle industries of Melbourne will go out of business at a zero tariff. He was quite happy to say it, to blackguard the former Prime Minister in his reply to the statement the night after the statement in 1991, but then suggested it's disinformation on my part. Now, Mr Speaker, the press gallery copped him, of course, hook, line and sinker on this. And I just say to them that no, I am advisedly, in their ignorance, they are paid to understand the difference between the parties on these points of detail. And if they don't want to apply themselves to understand the difference between the parties on these points of detail, yes, I am.
The member for Isaacs will cease interjecting.
Because I programmed them so well they didn't know when the program finished. It finished at 25, 15, 5 and 0, and not 0 across the board. So, Mr Speaker...
Order! There is far too much noise.
Mr.
Members
Speaker,
on my left will cease
Mr Speaker, in this case, the disinformation...
I warn the member
the disinformation of the Leader of the Opposition... disinformation of the Leader of the Opposition, his obviously fear at being found out by the people of Wills about his policies, and the ignorance of the press gallery compounded, yes, their ignorance on this subject, compounded to simply mislead the electors of Wills and the people of the state of Victoria.
Order. The House will come to order. The member for Barker might resume his seat for a moment. The House will come to order. There's been far too much interjection during question time today. If members continue to interject, I will give a general warning to members and I will then name members. Continual heckling and interjections during question time or any other part of the proceedings of the House are out of order. I'd remind members of standing orders which provide that members and ministers shall be heard in silence, and I'll remind all members on both sides that we will have silence during question time. Members can ask questions and they will receive answers from ministers. Order! And if there is any continual interjection in the future, I will name those involved. The honourable member for Barker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister on the subject of making distinctions. Last year, on the 14th of March, you said that the TCF and motor vehicle industries were having a loaf behind the tariff wall. And you said, if they're non-competitive and can never be competitive, frankly, we're better off without them. You also said that protection was a monkey on the back of every exporter. Last Friday, you justify your reversals from these views by saying last Friday...
The House will come to order. members on my left will cease interjecting. Order! The House will come to order. The honourable member for Barker, the Prime Minister will cease interjecting. Order! Order! The member for Barker.
You got him under control, Mr. Speaker?
The member for Barker. The member for Barker.
You also said that
the member for Barker will withdraw that remark. The honourable member for Barker.
Last Friday, Prime Minister, you justified your reversal from these views by saying that quantitative restrictions limited world trade in textiles, clothing, footwear and cars. In the interest of consistency and making distinctions, what do you now say to those industries who claim protection for the sugar, cheese, fruit and other agricultural commodities where similar or more corrupt world markets exist?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, you see, this is a question from a party which built the tariff wall, and then took no steps to dismantle it, not understanding, Mr. Speaker, when I say that tariffs were a monkey on the back of Australian efficiency, of course they were. Of course they were. But I remind you, the effective rate of protection for clothing in 1983-84 was 222%. 222. As a result of the March 91 program, it's 52. 52 effective protection. Footwear was 250. As a result of the program, it'll be 36. I mean, it's a discussion about order and magnitude, not absolutes, like Captain Zero here. Zero inflation,
the Prime Minister
zero
referred
tariffs,
to the Leader of the Opposition
zero
by his
growth,
title.
zero employment. Now, Mr. Speaker,
Order! The House will come to order.
On motor vehicles, the same figures were 250% in 83-84, falling to 36% effective rates of protection at the end of the 1991 plan. That is by the year 1996-97, from 250 to 36%. But you're saying, unless it's zero, it's of no value. Unless it's zero, anything I've said about these massive, poisonous levels of protection is invalid. I mean, what an absurd conclusion to draw. What an absurd conclusion to try and draw.
Order!
And I picked you up on the 17th of September 1990 when you were going around industry groups talking about zero protection for motor cars, and the reason I didn't make more of it was Senator Button rang me and said, if you continue to point to McLaughlin's words on this, the Toyota company and the other car companies thinking of investing in Australia won't. So in deference to the interest of getting that $400 million plant in Victoria, I didn't go on with you in the House of Representatives. I took you on once and that was it. And the fact is, like, you know, ignorance is bliss. Ignorance is bliss, wandering around, oh, let's have zero protection levels. Let's have zero levels of protection by the year 2000. Let's not wonder whether or not we might actually snuff out a state-of-the-art plant which will rebuild the Australian motor vehicle industry. Let's not consider the Falcon replacement by Ford. Let's just, in our ideological obsession and blank laziness, and having never touched these tariffs in the past, just to cheaply one-up the government by saying zero. That is, we spend 10 years getting those 250% levels down. You have the cheap zero one-up. Oh no, we'll one-up them by saying zero. And we're supposed to say, oh, well, isn't that brave? Isn't that unbelievably hairy-chested? When you've done nothing over the years, including the fatal 7 years when you had the chance to do it between 76 and 83, you actually increase protection. And then you come as a principal advisor to that government and seek, with credibility, to be listened to on tariffs. With credibility. And when you say you're going to take 15% to zero, we're supposed to say, oh, well, aren't you brave? I mean, aren't you brave? I mean, the fact is you are irresponsible. And that's the fact. The Leader of the Opposition said the other day, I had by saying this, put back the discussion on rationalist policy in this country. That was what he claimed. The fact is, if the Leader of the Opposition wanted to do something decent and sensible on tariffs, he should have said, we of course support and adopt the government's program, phase reduction.
The Prime Minister might resume his seat. The honourable member for O'Connor on a point of order.
Section 145 is the standing order relative to relevance. I think you heard the question. I did. It asked questions about the sugar industry and other agricultural areas. I think after 5 minutes the Prime Minister might even refer and answer the question.
Order. The Prime Minister was asked a question on tariffs. The Prime Minister
Mr. Speaker, if the Leader of the Opposition wanted genuine bipartisanship and a help on this subject, when the oppositions have provided no help for 30 years on the subject, he should have said, we will adopt the government's phase-down program and reserve the right to review it in the year 2000. No problem. No problem. But he has to be the cheap one-upper. He puts the zero in. He doesn't want any consensus, no bilateral discussion, no bipartisanship, just the zero, and then run around saying how pure market they are, how purist they are, when in fact this government had to deal with all the industries, Labor, all the discussions with the various sectors of industry and the unions to get these path-breaking tariff reforms. And because we take them to 25, 15, 5 and 0, we have a rebuke from the Leader of the Opposition to the then Prime Minister in the House saying, although he will still only have 25%, he'll still have 25% on TCF and 15% on auto industry by the year 2000. Quite happy to make the divisive distinction then, very unhappy for me to make it at the Southern Pacific Tyre plant. Very unhappy for me to make it. Now let me say this about quantitative restrictions. We removed the quantitative restrictions in the auto industry and on clothing. Quotas were sold backwards and forwards through the 70s and early 80s. You'd see them advertised in the Sydney Morning Herald. You could go and buy so many quota imports from certain people who awarded them. You know what the rate of protection is with quotas? Infinity. Infinity is the rate of protection while quotas exist. And who wiped all quotas out? This government. And we fought in the GATT to wipe it out on agriculture. In the GATT. But how effective have you ever been on agricultural protectionism through the 70s and the early 80s when it was still winding up? Not effective at all. Well, just hurting you, Wally.
The honourable member for Hume on a point of order.
Well, if you were telling the truth, we'd be able to take issue with you.
The honourable member for Hume will get to his point of order.
Mr. Speaker, it's in connection with the answer at present being given by the Prime Minister to a question asked by the member for Barker. The member for Barker said, and I just remind you, in the interest of consistency, what do you now say to those industries who claim protection for the sugar, cheese, fruit and many other agricultural commodities where similar or more corrupt world markets exist? Mr. Speaker, in the interest of fairness and equity, I ask that you direct the Prime Minister to answer the question.
Order. The Prime Minister has been asked a question. The Prime Minister is answering the question. The Honourable Prime Minister.
I'm answering on that very point, Mr. Speaker.
The House will come to order.
Mr. Speaker, the former member for Richmond, Mr. Anthony, walked out of the GATT discussions on agricultural protectionism in the 1970s. In the 1970s, was totally powerless, useless, absolutely useless. Didn't develop the Cairns group. Didn't put together a lobbying operation, the likes of which have never been seen on agriculture. Couldn't even get agriculture onto the GATT agenda. Couldn't even get onto the GATT agenda. And yet you've got the hide to continue to ask us about quantitative restrictions in agriculture by other countries. Of course there's quantitative restrictions, and we want to knock them down. That's the whole point of the GATT. But nothing detracts from the opportunist statements you've made about tariffs, seeking to garner to yourselves some kind of marks as people interested in economic efficiency, to highlight differences between the government and the opposition when it suits you, and then to suggest when I refer to those differences to say that I am engaging in disinformation. And, Mr. Speaker, the fact is the Leader of the Opposition, the member for Bennelong and the ministers who are part of the front bench, who are part of that government between 76 and 83, have not a shred of credibility on tariff reductions, not a shred. And the Australian public ought to take absolutely no notice of their statements, because they'd go to water like they've always gone to water in the face of the first whiff of grape shot.
The honourable member for Canning. Order.
My question without notice is also directed to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister inform the House of the impact of a goods and services tax on job creation?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker.
Order.
Out of order. The Prime Minister has declared he's not having a goods and services tax, and he should not waste the time of this House dealing with matters for which he is not responsible.
Will resume his seat. There is no point of order. The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker.
Order.
Mr Speaker, I believe a goods and services tax, particularly fashioned as the one proposed by the opposition, would be so disruptive of economic activity and economic growth as to render a severe disservice and damage to this country. Now, Mr Speaker, it is true the opposition parties are proposing a GST, and they've pamphleted the country with this pamphlet, Fight Back, to the people of the Australian Capital Territory, I presume amongst others. The first point is 2 million more jobs created by abolishing 7 unfair taxes. 2 million more jobs created by abolishing 7 unfair taxes and rebuilding business. This is the 2 million which the Leader of the Opposition said was a guesstimate which came out of an economic projection which did not even model the GST. The GST, which actually replaces the 7 taxes, so referred to, was not even modelled. The Leader of the Opposition said in his media statement of the 27th of February, Fight Back was not modelled. So therefore the 2 million jobs, which he described as a guesstimate on his part, they are now claimed at the top of the pamphlet and claimed in relation to the GST, which replaces the 7 taxes, even though he says the GST was not part of the modelling exercise and Fight Back was not modelled. In other words, the pamphlet is a fraud. The pamphlet's a fraud. And it goes on, Mr Speaker, it goes on to say at point 6, customs duties to be abolished. As Australian industries become more cost efficient, both local and imported goods will be cheaper. In other words, as the tariff goes and customs duties are abolished, this is one of the 7 points of the 7 unfair taxes to be removed, the very removal of which the opposition said I was engaging in disinformation in pointing out last week at the Southern Pacific Tyre Factory. He's got it up this week as a principal point in his pamphlet. I mean, how duplicitous and dishonest can you be? And then when we get round to the rest of it, Mr Speaker, he talks about the GST. It says, and you can hardly find a reference to it, GST growing stronger together. Not goods and services tax, growing stronger together, won't even admit to what it is. And then it says, with the wholesale sales tax, fuel excise and payroll being abolished, some prices will stay the same, others will rise marginally with the GST. Marginally. In other words, the picture is some will go down, some will stay the same, and a couple will go up. That's the sort of picture. In fact, the Treasurer pointed out in his speech, a ministerial statement recently on the GST, that the estimated price effects of the opposition's package by the Treasury on food products generally will be 8.9% overall. Dairy products increased by 9.6%, cereal products increased by 9.2%, fresh fruit and vegetables by 10.1%. Hardly marginal. And yet this is the dishonesty of this pamphlet. So you've got an overall 8.9% increase in food, taking all your policies into account, and yet this pamphlet has you as will rise marginally with the GST. And the GST is described as growing stronger together, not a goods and services tax, growing strongly together. Then you claim 2 million jobs, which you say was not modelled. So it's a hoax. What can any person in the public believe of this other than it's a hoax? A hoax document. 2 million jobs you say were picked out of a hat. 2 million jobs which refer to 7 unfair taxes. Taxes which are going to be replaced by a GST, yet you say the GST wasn't modelled to produce the 2 million estimate. Talk about lying straight in bed. Brother, how do you do it with these sort of things? I mean, fancy putting... There you are, there's your pictures, there they are. And what about you?
Order.
Oh, goody, you. You've got your picture on the back too, the member of the National Party. I mean, you two would say anything to move an inch. Would say anything. Claim anything to move an inch in public affairs.
Order. The House will come to order.
What we're going to see, we will see from the opposition...
Order. The member for Bass.
What we'll see until polling day are lies like this, from go to woe. Lies like this from go to woe. Just straight, unadulterated lying.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question without notice is again to the Prime Minister, and I refer the Prime Minister to his last answer in relation to his reversal on protection policy. The Prime Minister would also be aware of an interview between Senator Button and Maxine McHugh on PM radio last week, where Ms McHugh asked Senator Button, "It's not like Mr Keating to get caught out, though, is it?" And Senator Button answered, "Every politician gets caught out from time to time with a remark on radio programs, I suspect." I asked the Prime Minister, who's telling the truth, you or Senator Button?
Senator Button had not seen my references in the House and was mistaken. It's as simple as that.
Order. I warn the member for Gippsland.
Mr Speaker, I wasn't caught out at all.
Order. The House will come to order.
Mr Speaker, in building a competitive Australia on the 12th of March 1991, I say at page 2.2, today's statement completes the program announced in the economic statement of May 1988. That's what I said. And then, as I repeated to you, I don't think I'll bother going on about it much longer, but I'll just make the point again, that I said to Hayden Sargent the day after, so if you take clothing, footwear, that tax is going to be down from 35% to 15%. In other words, that's the end of the section, that's the end of the phase down. And I went on to say, this started in the package of 87-88 and the phasing will complete in 1997 or the year 2000 as a result of the second stage announced yesterday. Now, the fact is, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition, stung by the fact that he knows he's running a policy which will knock jobs out by their thousands in Melbourne and in Wills, and when pinned on his differences, which he's quite happy to make marked in the statement about customs duties will be abolished in your pamphlet, when I pin you on these things, you want to slink off and hide behind a radio transcript and hide behind or the general ignorance on the press gallery on this point. You hide behind them. The fact is, Mr Speaker, this government embarked upon a program reduction in tariffs from those 250 and 220% levels on a phased basis to end point reductions of 25, 15, 5 and 0, which as far as I'm concerned is, as I said in that statement, ends forever Australia's sorry association with the tariff as a device for industrial development. Ends forever. In other words, the wall is down. The wall is down. Ends forever Australia's sorry association with the tariff. By turning its back on tariffs, Australia will be further repelled in its quest for international trade and efficiency. But it didn't mean wiping out the Toyota investment at $400 million with a zero tariff. It didn't mean wiping out the broadloom TCF industries and those apparel industries which can survive at 15%, because the government studiously, carefully made assessments about the protection phase down they could bear. And the fact that you didn't, in your cheap one-upmanship, your cheap shot at the zero tariff, given no more thought than that, for the opportunists that you are, you put the zero in and think you're going to get some public remarks from it. It just simply shows that not only do you not know about these industries, you don't care about them, and you're quite happy to try and score, as usual, a cheap shot, but not doing any of the hard work that would ever put you in a position to get within shooting distance of zero.
The honourable member for Melbourne Ports.
Mr Speaker, my question is directed to the Minister for Social Security. I asked the Minister when will the recently announced increases in some social welfare payments be made, and would he also be prepared to comment on the adverse consequences in the current economic climate if social welfare payments were reduced?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr Speaker, of course some of the announced cuts are already in place in relation to extending the availability of rent assistance to those singles under 21. In addition, the other payments will be made this week in relation to family allowance, and they, of course, were decisions made before there was any Wills by-election announced or considered. And they were part of the February statement designed, above all else, to inject an impetus into this economy. That's their prime purpose, those one-off payments of family allowance. Of course, the follow-up payments in relation to family allowance supplement are intended to provide a continuing increased support for low-income families in this society. But of course, what we hear in contrast to what this government is doing are proposals that there should be massive cuts in social welfare. I understand that there has been a proposal that there should be a 30% cut in social welfare payments. I understand that that originates from the Liberal candidate for Wills, Mr John Delacrate. Now, I find it inconceivable that any figure in public life in this country could make a suggestion of a 30% cut in social welfare payments. I gather he's also in favour of sending all unemployed migrants back home. I gather he's also inclined to axe the subsidy paid to some rival duster company which employs disabled people. That should be cut off too. This gives us a real insight into the type of candidate put forward by the Liberal Party in Wills. And I've noticed no effort whatsoever to distance the Liberal Party from this candidate, to repudiate these kinds of views. And of course, that isn't that surprising, because when you look at the Fight Back package, in many ways it's a sophisticated version in a number of areas of the 30%, the rather crude comments made by the Liberal candidate for Wills. Now, if you look, for instance, at unemployment benefits, if you follow the man from Wills, you could cut the social welfare benefit to the unemployed by 30%, and that would reduce the payments to those on job search allowance by $84.60 a fortnight. That's what a 30% cut means, $84.60 a fortnight. Or, of course, you could do it in a more subtle way. You could change the eligibility for job search groups. Now, of course, that may sound a bit far-fetched, but when you read Fight Back, that's exactly what the opposition proposes about many of the long-term unemployed. That is, they will have their unemployment benefits cut off after 9 months. Well, I thought we'd get that sort of nonsense, so I thought I'd just look at what your spokesman on social services said. Senator Alston said, and without any qualification whatsoever, I quote him, "People looking for work will be paid the job search allowance for 9 months." And that's the end. Well, I'll go on with what he said because it might interest the National Party. People looking for work will be paid the job search allowance for 9 months. They should use their own resources first, and once they run out of their own resources, they claim for Social Security. That is, they should become destitute before they can apply for Social Security. They should use their own resources first before... tell the farmers that. So, your own spokesman makes no equivocation about cutting off those payments after 9 months. And that would cut out some 90,000 unemployed, and therefore you'd have a massive cut, not the crude 30% of the candidate for Wills, but a very effective cut in social welfare benefits by changing eligibility. You could do exactly the same, again, when you look at the family support arrangements. Mr Delacrate would suggest that you cut that by 30%. Or you could do, as the opposition does in Fight Back, you could change the eligibility rule for sole parents' pension. That is, remove the pension as soon as the youngest child turns 12, and that would mean 30,000 parents would be cut out of that benefit. Again, it's a subtle and more sophisticated version of what the candidate for Wills is saying. Now, I'm not sure that the candidate for Wills even understands that family allowance and family allowance supplement are all part of the social welfare net. But of course, if you started cutting family allowances by 30%, that you'd reduce them by $6.20 per child per fortnight, so that a family with 3 children would lose $18.60 a fortnight.
if you started cutting our family allowance supplement provision, then for children under 13, that would mean a $25.80 a fortnight cut, or for children 13 to 15, it would mean for children over 15, that's 13 to 15, it would mean $25.80. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, some of the heckling interrupted that. Let me just make it plain to them. The effect of their cut, that is, for children under 13, it would mean an $18.20 cut a fortnight. For children between 13 and 15, a $25.80 cut a fortnight. And that would affect in wills, and I'd remind the candidate for wills, those sort of cuts would affect some 11,000 families in wills. Now, of course, the opposition is more subtle and sophisticated again. What it is saying is we will change the eligibility rules for family allowance. It's not quite clear from the Fight Back document all the rules about income in relation to families that will apply, but taking the most conservative view, it would mean that some 190,000 families across Australia would be denied family allowance. In wills, that would mean about 1,000 families in wills would simply go off family allowance as a result of the Fight Back proposals. What the wills electorate, I think, is beginning clearly to realise that Mr Delacrati is very much a supporter of the cuts proposed by the Leader of the Opposition, cuts which would destroy and slash the safety net for social welfare that we have provided in this country.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question without notice is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister will recall his statement to John Laws early last year to the effect that protection is a tax. Will the Prime Minister now confirm that tariff protection of clothing and footwear increases tax on the average Australian household by over $300 per year, and that the effect of this tax falls most heavily on the poorer households? How does the Prime Minister justify this additional tax and its heavy impact on the poor?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker,
order. The House will come to order.
It was 227%. It will fall to an effective rate of 50, Mr. Speaker. It was 227%, and it will fall to an effective rate of 50. That's
the Minister for Immigration will cease interjecting.
But, Mr. Speaker, maybe I could turn the question to the Leader of the Opposition and say, why didn't you advise the former government of this heavy tax when it was 227%? Why didn't you? I asked you last week to give us any papers to table any advisings you gave the former government about the need to cut these punitive levels of tariff protection. And so far we've seen nothing from you. So far we've seen nothing from you. I mean, when you ever had an opportunity to exercise any executive responsibility in this country, with what credibility are we to regard you when you were happy to leave 250% for footwear, 222% for clothing, 227% for clothing and footwear overall, down to these levels, 36 and 50%, which will allow, Mr. Speaker, efficient industries to stay in business. That is, industries which have made the changes and which will stay in business. And the same on motor cars. Mr. Speaker, on motor cars, in the period of the Fraser government, over the 8 years, they fell from 150% tariff to 125%. In 8 years, I mean, how pathetic. They went from 150% to 125%. Now, Mr. Speaker, under our policies, we've led the industry to rationalise from 13 models in 1984 to 6 models in 1992, with massive export growth throughout the whole of the 1980s. Average production increased from 28,000 units per model, a run of 28,000 cars, to an average of 45,000 cars per model. Exports increased from $370 million at the beginning of the 80s to over $1 billion this year, and rising strongly. I mean, that's been the enormous difference from 13 to 6 models, from a run of 28 to 45,000, and from $370 million of exports to $1 billion. From 77.8 to 82.3, investment in the automotive industry grew by -1.6 per annum. Under us, it's increased by over 10% per annum. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's the restructuring which this government has conscientiously undertaken, and we've seen that rationalisation of models and efficiency, and we're seeing it in the clothing, textile and footwear industry. but getting questions from people who have never raised their finger to lower tariffs, never raised their finger to lower tariffs, never raised their finger, can't produce a document or authenticate one effort on their part, sat there frozen for 7 years with these high tariffs around our heads, poisoning the culture of our industries, poisoning the practices of Australian management, to then say if it's not zero, it's nothing, just points to the extremism and shallowness which I think are part and parcel of you and your policies. You don't understand. If it's not on a theoretical basis out of some textbook or off a computer program or falling out of a merchant bank, you don't understand. You've never been to these places. You've never talked to these industries. You don't understand the damage that those policies would reap upon them. And when the government wants to sensibly reduce them and doing it in a way where the reductions stick, where the reforms stick, you ask me a question about taxes on the public when we're talking about levels which are infinitesimal compared to what they were when we began.
The honourable member for Burke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
If the honourable member for O'Connor interjects again, I'll name him. The honourable member for Burke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the Prime Minister is firing on all six, I have one for him as well.
Order. The House will come to order.
Mr. Speaker.
Order. The honourable member for Burke will ask his question.
Don't worry. Mr. Speaker,
Order.
Mr. Speaker, my question concerns education and training opportunities for young people. And I ask the Prime Minister, is he aware of recent claims that attempts to place apprentices in work in Melbourne are failing? And if so, can I ask him to outline to the House what the government is doing to provide more opportunities for young Australians through education and training?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Dunkley made that claim last week, and I just make these points that in the One Nation statement it included an extra payment of $2,000 for each additional first-year apprentice, which employers take on in 1992, and an increase in the initial craft payment to $3,500. This measure is expected to encourage an additional 9,000 first-year apprentices during 92. A doubling to $2,000 for 1992 of the incentive to employers of all trainees under the Australian traineeship system who commence after 1 January 92, expected to encourage an additional 10,000 trainees in 1992. $5 million to provide a wage subsidy to employers of second-year apprentices at risk of retrenchment. Some 3,200 young people expected to be helped by this measure. And of course, before the One Nation statement, the government extended other measures which will add some 7,000 young people are expected to be helped by those changes. Now, Mr. Speaker, the member for Dunkley last week asked a question where he asserted that there were, he said, knowing that, does the Prime Minister know that this group, which was called the Inner Northern Group Training, now has more than 250 out-of-work apprentices on its books? Now, I received today a letter from the Inner Northern Group Training Limited, which I'll read to the House, Mr. Speaker, on this subject. Dear Sir, on Thursday last, the 26th of March, you were asked a question by Mr F. Ford, member for Dunkley. The question asked whether you are aware of the existence of my company, Inner Northern Group Training Limited, which he erroneously stated had 250 out-of-work apprentices on their books. The fact of the matter is that we have more than 150 apprentices on our books who are employed. We do have a register of apprentices made out of trade by other employers, but not by us. Those out-of-work apprentices are not on our books. We keep this register to assist our speedy placement of them when we find additional positions. He went on to say, furthermore, for the last 2 years, we've consistently averaged placing another 80 apprentices per year, or nearly 7 per every month, in employment. After taking our graduations into account, we've increased our numbers of apprentices and trainees trainee employees from 107 at 1 July 90 to 152 today. Not only have we increased our number of apprentices and trainees, we've also expanded a career advisory service. We're also running pre-employment courses. This misrepresentation of our company's performance alone is sufficiently galling to my board and staff, but it has already had commercial repercussions for us, with a number of our clients phoning us to ask us if the company was in difficulties. Such rumours, which are totally unfounded and lacking in substance, can lead to clients deserting our successful organisation. This, however, has not been the worst impact. We are currently nearing completion of sensitive negotiations with our entire industry to provide services to their training organisation. These negotiations involve both a trades union and an employer association. Due specifically to this question being asked by the member for Dunkley, anxieties have been expressed to us about whether we have the capacity to fulfil our obligation in the proposed agreement. He goes on to say, we do consider that, as you were the recipient of the question, we need to inform you both of our intense anger at the member for Dunkley's action and, more importantly, of the facts of the case. We'll be contacting the Leader of the Opposition in this matter, seeking an apology and complete withdrawal of any implications regarding our company's trading position or level of performance. The extent of the damage which has already been done is hard to ascertain, but rumours spread quickly and do damage irrespective of the facts. This is because it's presumed that parliamentarians have access to accurate inside information. Obviously, this is not always so, as our example proved. Now, Mr Speaker, that's signed by Paul Martin, General Manager. Now, Mr Speaker, again, this is another cheap shot by the opposition in this campaign for the by-election in Wills. And the member for Dunkley, obviously not knowing the facts, asked this question in the House, and has now been seriously and comprehensively rebuked by the owner of this business, who's now called for an apology and a withdrawal, and I hope that the member for Dunkley obliges him. But, Mr Speaker, it ranks just as the tariff changes, just as the tariff proposals of the opposition. It's hurting people. They will resort to any obfuscation to make a cheap political point, whether it's an easily grabbed zero in the tariff schedule or whether it's this fallacious claim by you. The fact is you've been shown up to be the fraud you are by the owner of the business.
Yeah. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Order.
My question without notice is again to the Prime Minister. I asked the Prime Minister if the logic of the answer, his last answer to the last question is to be the last question we asked him is to be accepted. If the logic of his answer to our last question is to be accepted, namely that output and exports have been boosted by cuts in protection, then why don't you scrap protection altogether? And why don't you do it properly, by doing it with genuine reform that scraps payroll tax, sales tax, petrol excise and dramatically lowers business costs across the board?
The Honourable Prime Minister. Order. The Leader of the National Party will
I suppose genuine reform doesn't refer to a competitive exchange rate mechanism. I suppose genuine reform doesn't refer to a 39% corporate tax, full dividend imputation, a first-rate world-ranking depreciation schedule. I suppose genuine reform doesn't refer to a 50% jump in waterfront productivity. I suppose genuine reform doesn't go to rebuilding the trunk railway network to move product around this country. I suppose genuine reform doesn't go to the establishment of an interstate electricity grid to provide better prices for electricity across the country. I suppose genuine reform doesn't go to giving kids a chance of vocational training in TAFE. Oh, he always turns his back. He doesn't like the answers. I suppose all these, but genuine reform, none of those things are genuine reform. But the Mickey Mouse policy of reducing the excise on petrol, that's genuine reform. That's genuine reform. And as if an abolition of payroll tax at the expense of the doubling of the inflation rate could ever be genuine reform, And I suppose those hundreds of enterprise agreements now being negotiated in the workplace by unions and employers couldn't be genuine reform. I suppose that the 10% reduction in unit labour costs from 1983 and the attendant increase in profitability over the period is not genuine reform. But what is genuine reform is this Mickey Mouse package which turns up under the guise of a goods and services tax, a consumption tax which is about changing the life of every Australian by this disruptive tax on the way they live for the things which they must buy for themselves. Now, Mr Speaker, the theory of it, he says. Now, the question says so much about the Leader of the Opposition. That is the wide-eyed theorist Captain Zero. Zero inflation, zero tariffs, zero growth, zero employment, all the other sort of things. But, Mr Speaker,
Order.
you see, If it's not in a textbook, well then that's it. But if you ask them in the textbooks in the 70s, how do you actually get the protection levels down? How do you laboriously bring down, how do you produce that falling red line in the levels of effective protection in Australia? You wouldn't have found it in a textbook. I can tell you that. It had to come from creativity, talking to people, and a bit of good old-fashioned courage, which you never had. And so now you ask me the threadbare question, well, what about the theory of it? If the theory says zero, why don't you go to zero? Well, I suppose any of us could have said in the 1980s, well, listen, there's tariffs at zero, that's it, bad luck, adjust yourselves, do your best. And what we would have had was massive layouts in industry, enormous disruption, and of course, in the end, a reversal of the policy and no change. And, Mr Speaker, that is the difference between the government and the opposition. The government steadily, sure-footedly, carefully, conscientiously evaluated these industries and made the changes. In fact, what we see from the Leader of the Opposition is simply the adoption of a theoretical target with no practical or sensible application to the real economy and the people who live and work in it. And that says, the question says more about his view of economic and political life than I could have said in 15 answers to questions.
The honourable member for Parramatta.
Mr Speaker, I direct my question without notice to the Minister for Employment, Education and Training. I ask the Minister, have there been any attempts to estimate the resource requirements of TAFE and the training sector for the remainder of this decade? If so, what are the government's response to these estimates? Is the Minister aware of any alternative proposals relating to the resource requirements of the TAFE sector, and what are the government's intentions in this regard?
The honourable Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes, I have seen estimates about what is required, and they're commonly accepted estimates, about what is required to bring vocational education and training up to expenditures on them up to acceptable levels in this community. They were made last year by the Fin Committee, and they were consistent with earlier projections by the Devison Review of Training Costs and Award Restructuring. And they recommended that the annual expenditures on the annual costs of TAFE and training should rise between $800 million and $1 billion over 1991 levels by the end of the decade. That is, in each year, somewhere between $800 million and $1 billion ought to be being spent if we are to achieve acceptable levels of participation in vocational education. Now, the One Nation package offers progress right on target for achievement of that expenditure. It offers full Commonwealth responsibility for the funding of vocational education and training, the establishment of legislated, guaranteed triennial funding, and growth totalling $720 million over the 93-95 triennium, and that rate of growth, as I said, is on a trajectory to achieve the Fin Committee projections. Now, there is an alternative proposal from the opposition in their fight-back document. And they have to tell us in the main document. They say the reality is that this Labor government spends too little on the education and training of young Australians. Further on, we are told that the Liberal and National parties will, quote, respond to the sentiment of the Devison and Fin reports and provide an additional $520 million for TAFE over the rest of this decade to fund growth, opportunity and world-class skills. That's not $520 million per annum. That's $520 million in total that they will be prepared to provide over. So if that is going to be their objective, and were they to get into office, instead of achieving close to the $800 million to $1 billion at the end of the decade, they would merely be falling some $900 million short. Just $900 million short. But there's more to it than that, because there are other elements to the opposition's policy likely to impact on expenditures outlays in vocational education and training. And there we come to their position that they adopt on general purpose payments to the states, where they say they will reduce it by 5%. Now, if you look at what the states are currently spending on vocational education and training, they spend $1.5 billion per annum. So if the states quite reasonably make across-the-board adjustments in the face of those sorts of, cuts, they will find that spending in the states would be reduced by what? $75 million. So in effect, what the opposition $75 million becomes is $75 million to replace the $75 million that the states have been required to spend. So the response to the sentiment of Finn is zero, as far as the opposition is concerned. On a par with Captain Zero's other achievements, as far as that is concerned. Zero increase in funds, zero commitment.
The Minister will refer to the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, I asked that the Minister with...
Order.
Mr. Speaker, with great
interjecting
respect, today there's been evidence that there's one rule for the Prime Minister and the Leader of the House and another rule for the rest of the House.
Does the member have a point of order?
Yes, I asked that the member withdraw. The Minister withdraw.
I asked the Minister to refer to members by their titles and... Order. I've asked the Minister to refer to the member by his title, and the Minister has referred to the member by his title. I don't think...
Leader of the Opposition, yes. Well, as far as the Opposition is
Mr. Speaker,
piece,
the member for
on the further point of order, the Minister has failed to withdraw. And this is a clear campaign. You should be able to recognise it. You shouldn't have to be reminded.
Order.
Are you going to withdraw
The
or
member
aren't
for
you?
O'Connor will resume his seat. I don't think even the member for O'Connor in his wildest flights of fancy would be trying to put to me that to use a remark such as that was unparliamentary. Indeed, it is not in the best interests of debate that members should use comments about other members that might refer to nicknames to them or impute nicknames to them. And I have drawn the Minister up and asked him to refer to the member by his title. But I don't think that he could suggest to me that what the Minister said was unparliamentary.
Mr. Speaker, on the further point of order, Standing Order 76 refers to personal reflections, but if that is the new ruling, I would ask that Captain Fatso please withdraw.
Order, and let me just say to the member for O'Connor, if he attempts an intervention like that when he doesn't have the call and he's not in order, I'll name him. The Honourable Minister.
I've had occasion.
The Honourable Minister.
I've had occasion to refer to the simian visage of the Honourable Member for O'Connor as he gibbers and twitters on the back bench. I think we can all take it. But getting back to the points on zero achievement as far as expenditure on vocational education and training. And this is what the opposition had to say about zero achievement on vocational education training. The coalition leads into their policy by stating that education training, quote, is the gift of the present to future generations. So the gift of the opposition to future generations is zero. When they open that gift box, they're going to have to live with the cardboard around it, because all that will be contained inside it is no gift but air and an IOU.
Mr. Speaker, I ask a further question.
The Honourable.